In the freezing dark of October 1448, a single spark on a Nithsdale ridge ignites the most sophisticated intelligence network in northern Europe. The Battle of Sark, 1448, testing the Lincluden Ordinances' defensive doctrine, begins not with a trumpet blast, but with the silent bloom of orange fire across the horizon. A chain of 20 beacons relays the alarm from the border to Edinburgh in under 4 hours. What unfolds near the Lochmaben Stone will produce the tactical system that eventually destroys the Black Douglases themselves. The riders of the West March do not wait. How does the fragile peace of the 1444 border truce dissolve into the smoke of a total war? The mechanisms of diplomacy break down as the Black Douglases realize that a lasting peace with England is a direct threat to their military legitimacy. A rusted iron billhook resting against a cottage wall is more than a tool. It is the primary instrument of a society built for perpetual alertness. While the young King James II navigates his minority, the Earl of Douglas orchestrates a failure of negotiations that ensures the sword remains the arbiter. Why do the Percys of Northumberland believe that a strike against Dunbar will shatter the Scottish resolve? Henry Percy crosses the border with the arrogance of a man who commands the most professional archers in the Western world. The heavy plate armor of the English vanguard catches the weak spring sun as they level the Scottish stronghold, triggering a cycle of tit-for-tat violence that cannot be contained. Each burnt village and stolen herd of cattle adds another link to a chain of retribution that leads directly to the banks of the River Sark. Does the Earl of Salisbury understand that burning Dumfries has only served to unify the warring Scottish clans? The destruction of the town centre forces the disparate Marcher families to look toward the Black Douglases for salvation rather than the distant crown. A 7-foot granite erratic known as the Lochmaben Stone stands as a silent witness to the gathering fury of the borderers. This ancient megalith marks the northern termination of the most dangerous ford on the River Esk, yet it is here that the English choose to stake their claim. Sir John Wallace of Craigie does not view the English longbow as an invincible weapon. He views it as a simple mechanical problem, requiring a brutal physical solution. The heavy iron head of a Lochaber axe catches the flickering campfire light as he drills his men in the discipline of the rapid charge. Wallace understands that the traditional Scottish shield wall is a stationary target that invites annihilation by arrow fire. He prepares his division of Ayrshiremen to do what no Scottish force has dared for 50 years. His men wait for the signal. How does a disorganized feudal levy transform into the disciplined common army that will decide the fate of the realm? The Lincluden Ordinances codify the laws of the marches, mandating that every man between 16 and 60 must serve with his own weapons and gear. A column of riders moves against a grey northern sky, their formations reflecting the rigorous annual drills of the Wappen Shores. These are not peasants driven to slaughter, but a professionalized infantry host trained to move as a single, lethal organism under the Douglas banner. Can the English commanders ignore the fact that they have camped in a triangular pocket of treacherous tidal mud? The Lochmaben Stone provides a symbolic headquarters for the Earl of Northumberland, but the geography of the site is a tactical nightmare. The thick parchment of the Lincluden Ordinances is now being translated into physical positioning as the Scots occupy the only firm high ground to the north. By settling between the River Sark and the Kirtle Water, the English have surrendered their ability to maneuver their heavy cavalry or retreat with speed. What does the English archer see through the thick autumn mist as the sun begins to climb over the Solway? The rhythmic surge of the incoming tide creates a low, grinding sound as the riverbanks transition into sucking October mud. Through the haze, the English scouts report movement that should not be possible. The Scottish host has arrived with a speed that defies their logistical expectations. 6,000 English soldiers reach for their bows, but the damp air of the marshlands is already beginning to affect the tension of their yew-wood weapons. Why does the Earl of Ormond smile as he observes the English army hurriedly deploying in panicked, rowdy lines? The rising tide of the Solway Firth is already transforming the River Esk into a churning tidal bore of deep, swirling water behind the English rearguard. Ormond recognizes that the English are trapped against a hydrographical clock that they cannot stop and cannot fight. Every minute the English spend organizing their archers is a minute the sea uses to close their only avenue of escape to the south. The geometry of the battlefield is shifting. The Battle of Sark, 1448, reaches its point of no return as the Scottish vanguard clears the high ground in perfect silence. A forest of steel spear points glints through the dissolving fog as Hugh Douglas gives the order for the centre to advance. This is the moment the Lincluden training meets the reality of English professional warfare on an open plain. The English archers raise their bows, unaware that the Scottish formation is not stopping to form a defensive square, but is accelerating into a sprint. The first arrow volley is the only one. Can the Scottish infantry maintain their cohesion as thousands of cloth-yard shafts rain down upon their advancing ranks? The sound of the first volley is not the ring of metal, but the dull thud of wood and bone as the front line takes the impact. Despite the casualties, the common army does not falter or seek cover. They follow the precise tactical doctrine established at Lincluden Abbey. Each man keeps his eyes on the standard of the Earl of Ormond, knowing that the distance between life and death is measured in speed. Why does Sir John Wallace shout for his men to join in hand strokes rather than standing to be shot like deer? The Scottish vanguard launches into a daring charge that covers the final 100 yards of firm ground in a desperate, lung-bursting sprint. A rusted iron billhook catches an English bowstring and severs it before the archer can draw a second shaft. By closing the distance so rapidly, Wallace nullifies the English longbow and forces the battle into the brutal, close-quarters environment where the Scottish polearm is king. The archers realize they are prey. What happens when the momentum of 4,000 charging Scots smashes into an English vanguard that has no room to maneuver? The English left wing buckles under the weight of the Lochaber axes and halberds that now reap through their ranks. Severed bowstrings and broken arrows litter the grass as the English archers, equipped only with light armor and short swords, find themselves overwhelmed by heavy polearms. The mechanism of the Scottish victory is simple. They have replaced a static defense with an overwhelming offensive impact that the English doctrine cannot absorb. The English standard begins to tilt. How does the legendary knight Magnus Redmayne respond as he sees the center of the English line starting to evaporate? Redmayne charges forward through the press, his rusted chainmail rattling as he seeks out Sir John Wallace for a decisive duel of commanders. He knows that if the Scottish vanguard is not checked, the panic currently rippling through the English rearguard will become a total collapse. The two men meet in a blur of iron and wood, but the professional soldier of the French wars finds no advantage against the raw fury of the Marcher Lord. Redmayne falls. The English army does not simply retreat, it is driven into the rising tidal waters of the Esk by a force that will not grant quarter. The grey churn of the Solway tide has now fully claimed the riverbanks, turning the shallow fords into lethal deep water traps. Those who survived the Scottish charge now face the choice of the Lochaber axe or the sucking silt of the riverbed. The Scottish commanders do not ransom the common soldiers. They execute the economics of border warfare by ensuring the invasion force is physically erased. The water runs dark. Does the Earl of Northumberland recognize the sacrifice his son is making as the English retreat turns into a mass drowning? Henry Percy, Lord Poynings, dismounts in the sucking silt to give his father his own horse as the Earl's mount falters in the rising water. It is a moment of cold, dynastic calculation where the survival of the House of Percy is prioritized over the life of its heir. Hundreds of English knights find that their wealth and status are useless against the crushing weight of the Solway tide. The river becomes a graveyard for kings. How many English soldiers vanish beneath the submerged iron helmets in the River Esk as the Battle of Sark 1448 reaches its climax? Contemporary chronicles record that 500 men drown in the tidal waters alone, unable to find footing in the shifting silt and mud. The Scottish spears continue to push from the north, ensuring that any man who reaches the bank is forced back into the swirling depths. This is the ultimate consequence of the English strategic error. They have allowed the landscape of Scotland to become their executioner. The Solway trap is closed. Why is the capture of Lord Poynings and Sir John Pennington within the cold stone walls of Lochmaben Castle a diplomatic disaster for Henry VI? The loss of so many high-ranking English commanders provides the Black Douglases with a windfall of ransoms and political leverage that will last for a decade. The Scottish victory at the Battle of Sark 1448 ensures that the northern border remains secure, while England descends into the dynastic chaos of the Wars of the Roses. For the Douglases, these prisoners are the proof that the king is no longer master. Does the sacrifice of Sir John Wallace of Craigie ultimately save the kingdom he fought so hard to defend? Wallace lies on his deathbed 3 months later, his final act being the renunciation of his lands under the wax seal of a deathbed confession. His tactical brilliance at Sark provided the blueprint for defeating the Longbow, yet his death leaves a void in the Scottish leadership that the king will soon exploit. The hero of the battle is celebrated in verse as his country's saviour, even as the political fires he helped stoke begin to consume his house. The Battle of Sark, 1448, remains the final set-piece triumph of the Scottish Common Army and the ultimate peak of Douglas power. The moss-covered granite of the Lochmaben stone stands today as a silent marker for a victory that the official Stuart histories tried for centuries to erase. Ormond is eventually executed for treason in 1455, following the total destruction of the Black Douglases at Arkinholm. This engagement signals the internal collapse of Lancastrian authority, leading directly into the dynastic carnage of the Wars of the Roses. Which historical turning point should we explore in our next deep dive? If this analysis of the Battle of Sark helped you understand the complexity of the medieval borders, scan the QR code on your screen to subscribe and continue the series.